Your medical history in casual settings at a certain stage of life, health matters naturally become part of daily existence. Medical appointments, medication adjustments, emerging discomforts, these realities are present and often find their way into conversation without much consideration. But after entering your 70s, it's worth considering carefully before sharing detailed medical information, particularly in casual or non-intimate environments. This caution isn't because your experiences lack importance, but because how others receive this information can fundamentally change how they perceive and interact with you. When you regularly discuss every diagnosis, procedure, or health concern, you risk having others begin viewing you exclusively through the lens of your medical conditions. You might notice people becoming unnecessarily cautious around you, offering pity rather than respect, or making assumptions about your capabilities and limitations. Once you've been categorized as fragile or declining, that perception becomes remarkably difficult to change. There's also a significant emotional cost to consider. Continuously recounting your health challenges can keep you mentally tethered to worry, fear, or even an identity centered on illness. When these details are shared with people who aren't close to you, it frequently leads to uncomfortable commentary, unwanted advice, or judgments you never solicited. You might hear statements like, "Should you really be taking that trip?" or "Perhaps independent living isn't appropriate for you anymore," all from individuals who lack a comprehensive understanding of your situation. Instead, consider sharing selectively with trusted loved ones, healthcare professionals, or others experiencing similar circumstances. By all means, communicate openly where it provides comfort and connection. But with others, you might simply say, "I'm managing some health matters, but I'm doing all right overall," and leave the conversation there. This isn't about hiding your reality, it's about preserving your autonomy and dignity. Those who navigate aging gracefully typically speak with intention and purpose. They recognize when opening up is beneficial and when certain information is better kept private, not from pride, but from wisdom gained through experience. Not every personal detail warrants public discussion, and protecting your narrative represents an important aspect of maintaining your strength and independence. If you're continuing to watch this presentation and finding these insights valuable, please comment number 2 below to indicate your presence. If you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to subscribe and activate notifications so you won't miss future content. Your support enables us to continue creating meaningful resources to inform and inspire you. Now, let's continue with our exploration. Your private regrets or past mistakes. Everyone carries chapters in their life story they'd prefer not to read aloud. But after reaching your 70s, there's an additional dimension to what we choose to revisit, and more importantly, what we decide to reveal to others. Regret has a peculiar persistence, especially when expressed in inappropriate contexts. While honesty and vulnerability certainly have their proper place, repeatedly sharing your past mistakes often creates more harm than healing, particularly when these stories are entrusted to people who haven't earned your complete confidence. When you discuss regrets, opportunities not taken, chances missed, people you've hurt, you expose a vulnerable part of yourself. If the listener responds with judgment, indifference, or dismissive comments, what was intended as unburdening can instead become another burden to carry. What might have brought relief instead reinforces emotional pain. You may notice that sharing these sensitive matters with someone who doesn't treat them with appropriate care transforms how they perceive you. They might begin treating you differently, defining your entire identity by a single unfortunate event, or overstepping boundaries with unsolicited advice, opinions, or assumptions about who you are today that fail to acknowledge your growth and evolution. Remember, you are not defined by your past. You are not merely a collection of wrong turns or missed opportunities. There's profound wisdom in recognizing which aspects of your story should be shared widely and which deserve to be processed privately or exclusively with truly safe individuals. This might be a professional therapist, a spiritual counselor, or a lifelong friend who understands your heart completely. With others, it's perfectly acceptable to simply acknowledge, "There are valuable lessons I've learned through difficult experiences," and leave the details unspoken. Your will or inheritance plans with non-legal parties. There's something profoundly personal and often emotionally charged about the legacy you choose to leave behind. After turning 70, many people begin considering their will, assets, and inheritance plans more seriously. But here's an important truth: unless someone is legally involved in managing that process, it's generally wiser to keep those specific details private. When you begin sharing information about who will receive what assets, how much each person will inherit, or when distributions will occur, you unintentionally create conditions for potential conflict. Expectations form quickly. Comparisons inevitably follow. People naturally begin questioning why certain decisions were made, why one person was selected over another, or why assets were distributed in a particular way. Even within close-knit families with positive relationships, matters involving money and inheritance can rapidly generate feelings of jealousy, entitlement, and misunderstanding more quickly than almost any other topic of conversation. Furthermore, sharing this type of information prematurely or without proper legal context can lead to complications later. Your circumstances or perspectives might change. You may revise your will. You might encounter situations you hadn't previously anticipated. When these details have already been openly discussed, modifying them later can be perceived as betrayal, even when the changes represent the most appropriate decisions for your situation. This explains why individuals who age thoughtfully tend to confine these matters within a small circle of trusted advisors. They work closely with qualified attorneys. They carefully select executors. They document their wishes clearly and legally, while limiting casual conversations that could potentially complicate family dynamics in the future. Your emotional vulnerabilities with untrustworthy people. A special kind of strength emerges with advancing age, the discernment to know when to open your heart and when to protect it. After reaching your 70s, emotional clarity becomes increasingly vital. Life experience has taught you that not everyone who listens deserves access to your deepest feelings. While expressing emotions in healthy ways remains important, sharing profound vulnerabilities with individuals who haven't demonstrated trustworthiness can leave you exposed in ways that cause more harm than healing. Sometimes a person appears sympathetic on the surface, they nod attentively, ask thoughtful questions, and show apparent interest. Yet later, you discover your private concerns being circulated as casual gossip. Worse still, your expressed fears might be weaponized against you, used to manipulate, control, or create an unfair or inaccurate characterization of your mental or emotional state. You might mention feelings of loneliness, concerns about losing independence, or how certain family dynamics weigh heavily on your heart. If these vulnerable expressions reach the wrong individuals, they can be misinterpreted or transformed into narratives that portray you as unstable, incapable, or overly emotional when you are none of these things. People who navigate aging gracefully learn to share their innermost feelings selectively. This doesn't mean becoming closed off or emotionally isolated, rather, it means developing discernment. They understand that meaningful vulnerability isn't about universal disclosure but about recognizing who provides genuine safety, who demonstrates consistency, and who honors your truth with respect and compassion. It's entirely appropriate to take your time, gradually testing the waters by observing how someone handles smaller confidences before entrusting them with deeper ones. Your relationship issues with your spouse or partner. Every meaningful relationship experiences fluctuations. Even the strongest partnerships have their challenging seasons. After spending decades together, it's natural for disagreements, frustrations, or even long-standing wounds to occasionally resurface. However, once you've reached your 70s, one of the wisest decisions you can make is protecting your relationship by refraining from discussing these difficulties with people who aren't directly involved or equipped to offer constructive support. The momentary relief gained from venting about your spouse to a friend, neighbor, or even a family member can be tempting. Perhaps you share feelings of being unheard or express frustration about recurring behaviors that continue to bother you. But what typically follows is problematic. The listener inevitably forms judgments and opinions. Once these perspectives take root, they permanently alter how that person perceives your partner. Even if the situation between you improves substantially later, what began as a private disagreement has now become part of your relationship's public narrative. People begin developing assumptions about your partnership. They might offer unsolicited advice or, more damagingly, begin taking sides without understanding the complete context, all of which creates additional strain on a relationship you've invested decades building and maintaining. Another important consideration exists. Sharing relationship frustrations too freely can sometimes prevent resolution by keeping you emotionally stuck. When you repeatedly vent without taking constructive action, the narrative becomes increasingly rigid. You find yourself reliving the conflict repeatedly instead of moving through it toward resolution. Your views on your adult children's choices as a parent, your deep concern for your children's well-being naturally extends throughout their entire lives, even well into their adulthood. You genuinely want the best outcomes for them. You instinctively wish to protect them from harm. Occasionally, you observe choices they're making regarding parenting approaches, relationship decisions, financial management, or lifestyle preferences that cause you concern or disagreement. However, after reaching your 70s, one of the most challenging yet essential skills to develop involves recognizing when restraint represents the wiser choice. Expressing opinions about your adult children's life decisions, particularly to others outside your immediate family, can quickly generate unintended consequences. What you sincerely intend as caring concern may be interpreted as criticism or interference. What you offer as hard-earned wisdom may be received as unwelcome judgment. When these opinions eventually reach your children, even through innocent channels of communication, the result often creates emotional distance, resentment, or enduring tension in your relationship. You might feel compelled to discuss your concerns with a friend or sibling. "I simply don't understand why Michael left his stable position," or "I wish Lisa would approach parenting differently." However, once these thoughts are verbalized, they persist in someone else's consciousness, potentially altering their perception of your child permanently. More problematically, if your comments eventually find their way back to your adult child, the trust you've carefully cultivated can suffer significant damage. People who maintain strong, healthy connections with their grown children typically practice emotional restraint and respectful boundaries. Your passwords, PINs, or important access information after entering your 70s, protecting your digital and financial security becomes increasingly crucial, as does carefully selecting who should have access to sensitive information. Sharing passwords, banking details, or key personal data, even with family members, should never be done casually or without proper safeguards. This caution isn't necessarily because you expect deliberate misuse, but because risk increases proportionally with each additional person who has access. It might seem convenient to provide your grandson with your email password so he can help troubleshoot technical issues. Perhaps you've informed a neighbor about where you store financial documents in case of emergency. However, once this information leaves your direct control, you cannot fully predict where it might circulate or how it could potentially be used. Elder fraud represents a genuine concern, and these violations don't always originate from strangers. Sometimes the perpetrator is a family member who feels entitled to your resources. Sometimes it's a friend experiencing financial hardship. In other instances, it's simply an inadvertent mistake, someone sharing your private information with another person with innocent intentions, not realizing they're compromising your security and privacy. The most prudent approach involves storing passwords and sensitive information securely while sharing access only through legally protected channels. This might include designating a trusted power of attorney, establishing specific access protocols with your financial institutions for authorized representatives, or utilizing a secure password management system where information can be safely retrieved when genuinely necessary. People who successfully maintain their independence in later years often share a common characteristic: they retain control over their personal information. Your plans to move, downsize, or change your living situation during your 70s and beyond, decisions about changing your living arrangements become deeply personal considerations. Perhaps you've contemplated relocating closer to family, downsizing to a more manageable property, or transitioning into a retirement community. However, this particular area involves a delicate balance. Sharing these plans prematurely or with too many people often invites unnecessary pressure before you've fully processed your own thoughts and preferences. What begins as a tentative consideration, "I might sell the house within the next year or two," can rapidly accelerate into a flood of opinions, assumptions, and even unwelcome assistance. Family members might advocate for quicker decisions than you're comfortable making. Friends might begin treating you differently, as though your current living situation is already temporary. Most concerning, others might start making arrangements on your behalf instead of respecting your agency in the decision-making process. The moment you share something as significant as a potential living transition, people naturally project their own concerns, desires, or perspectives onto your situation. You might hear comments like, "Don't move too far away, you'll regret selling your home," or "You should consider moving in with us instead." While typically well-intentioned, these responses aren't always helpful, particularly when you're still evaluating options. If you're still in the exploratory phase, this external input can cloud your judgment and create unnecessary tension. This explains why many individuals who approach aging thoughtfully choose to process these significant decisions privately first. They reflect through journaling. They consider spiritual dimensions through prayer or meditation. They consult with just one or two deeply trusted advisors rather than their entire social circle. Final thoughts as we conclude this presentation. Take a moment to reflect on what we've explored together. These 9 recommendations may appear relatively minor when considered individually, but when examined collectively, they converge around a fundamental principle: protecting your emotional well-being and personal boundaries. After reaching your 70s, your time, energy, and emotional security become increasingly precious resources. Understanding what information deserves protection can be just as important as knowing what to communicate openly. Which of these recommendations resonated most strongly with you personally? Have you experienced situations where sharing too much information later caused regret? Or have you learned through difficult experiences that certain matters are better kept within a trusted circle? If so, you're certainly not alone in these realizations. Many people reach this stage of life and discover that establishing boundaries isn't about creating isolation or distance. Rather, it's about creating protected space where mutual respect and clear communication can flourish. Meaningful sharing remains valuable and important, but now it's guided by wisdom, sharing thoughtfully with the right people at appropriate moments. This kind of discernment doesn't represent coldness or aloofness. It constitutes one of the most valuable gifts you can offer yourself, the gift of peace, dignity, and self-determination in your golden years. Thank you for joining this important conversation today. I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts and experiences. Please leave a comment sharing one insight you gained from our discussion and how you might apply it in your daily life. Your perspectives matter greatly to our community, so please don't hesitate to share them. Reading your comments provides tremendous motivation and encouragement for creating future content.